Hello, welcome to week number 2 of Writing 375. Today, Mr. G and I are going to talk about the short story. Mainly I'm going to talk about structural elements of a short story. So what is it besides size and word count that makes the short story unique from, say, the short story or from the novel? Let's quickly start with the short story form, which seems to be in page count anywhere from 2 pages to 50 pages. Once you get to 50 pages, we start talking about the long story or the novella. The short story is usually focused around a single source of conflict. It usually passes through a brief amount of time, and there's not a lot of physical spaces in the story. Now, of course, there are all sorts of exceptions to those rules, but that's sort of what the size of the short story often produces. And usually you have a story that only has at the most 1 or 2 viewpoint characters or narrators. Again, there are exceptions to that. Whereas the novel's big, it's pillowy, it could have several point of view characters, it could have several narrators, the book can pass through 200 years, it can pass through 1,000 years. It can pass over many continents. So the novel sort of breaks all of that up. There are many strands of conflict between many different kinds of characters. And then we have the short story. Whoa. So the short story, for me, is anywhere 1 word to a couple pages. I particularly like students and encourage students to really try to write under a couple hundred words. Like the short story, the short story has a single focused source of conflict. It most likely, even more often than the short story, has a single viewpoint character. I had to put Mr. G down. He was getting wiggly. So it has a single viewpoint character or a narrator, a single narrator. So most often short stories don't have the space to shift viewpoints. And what makes the short story very unique is that it has a different kind of structure. So one of the more conventional structures for fiction is conflict that builds into a crisis. The conflict reaches its boiling point, and something happens, something gives way or not, and then the story has its denouement, as the French like to say, or its falling action. Let me show you a little diagram, if I can. It's actually attached to your Moodle site, and I'm calling it Diagram 1. So Diagram 1 shows that story structure, the rising action, the crisis point, and the denouement, or the falling action, and that is in green. In the red, you have 3 different zones. One is somewhere amidst the rising action. You have another zone that is right before or around the crisis point. And then you have a zone that is far after the falling action, or I call it the aftermath. And often the short story takes place in those 3 zones. So it takes place way before the crisis point, or it takes place right before or after or somewhere around the crisis point, or it gives us a sense of the aftermath. A great example of the aftermath story would be, let me find my notes here. Oh, here we are. Would be the story Wig, which was in last week's handout by Brady Udall. We have a story where the narrator sees his son at breakfast. He's wearing a wig that he has found in the trash, and it immediately reminds him of his wife who's passed away. It's a grief story. It's a grief story. And the story, maybe it has its own little rising structure, but for most part, this story feels like way after the story has taken place. The story of what might have been the accident, or after the accident, and the way he immediately deals with it, the way he approaches his son, the way they begin to live together, right? All of that happens before the story begins. We just get this single little moment. Another story that feels like an aftermath story is Twins. Twins by Pamela Painter. A boy comes home, he finds a lot of people on the porch, people in the house. He learns from his father there's been an accident, one of their neighbors, and he learns that a boy that he babysits often has died in this accident, and the boy's twin brother is waiting for him in his room. So again, this is a moment in which the really crazy, terrible thing has happened, and it's sort of in the aftermath. It's an aftermath story. One of the things that most short stories have in common is that they pass through a very few seconds of time. It's the few seconds that narrator goes into the bedroom and has a very small interaction with this boy whose twin brother has died. Or in the story Spaceman, we just get a few seconds of his life, his decision to eject, and then his floating out into space and where his thoughts go in that moment. So a lot of these short stories, they just pass through a few moments. So the surface of the story, and I've been saying this in my Moodle comments, is very small. And yet the meaning we get from the story is quite large. So another thing that happens with these short stories is that they tend not to so much describe what I would call moments of becoming, where characters through plot, through action and reaction, through instance and decision, they end up changing. They change. They go through a transformation. The short story and the novel shows characters in transition of becoming somebody other. The short story certainly can do that, but it also sometimes, it just describes a moment of being, a character in a mind state, a character in an emotional state. And it describes that mind state and that state of being in all its complexity. So there's contradiction, there's conflict, but there may not be change. One of the stories in the packet that really shows that, I think describes a moment of being and not so much a character becoming something, is David Mean's The Project. When the narrator is just finding various places in his house to look at very closely. That's his project, right? He looks underneath the desk, he looks underneath the porch steps, and he's really doing it to get away from his family. So that is a story where we're seeing what the sort of complex state of separation, What is it like to be separated? I don't know that he's becoming something other than separated from his family. It's hard to say. So the short story has a small surface. It passes through just a few seconds of time. Like the short story, it has action. It's driven by the dramatic moment, right? We have characters, we have bits of dialogue, snippets. And yet it's just describing moments of being, moments of being. There's always going to be exceptions. There's always, you can easily say, well, Ponteri, actually I see the short story Cuts. The short story Cuts by Pamela Painter as describing actually a moment of becoming, in which a character actually becomes something other. So, of course, there are exceptions. The great thing about these forms is that they are sort of forms that emerge out of people resisting rules. The short story doesn't have to be 3 pages. It can be 1 word. So, the last thing I leave you with, what we're headed towards next week, a different kind of short story that you often have. It doesn't even feel like a dramatic story. It doesn't feel like a short story that has the characters and scene in conflict. Another kind of short story that has emerged is sort of contemporary versions of myths or lists, like Gregory Burnham's The Numbers. We're going to be writing list stories. Using the form of the myth or the fable or the parable and writing contemporary versions of those. In the reading that I've given for this week, you'll see Ayan Kawata's beautiful Castles in the Air, they're like little nightmares. And then Lydia Davis and a few other writers in the handout I've given you, they're not so much writing character-driven work as much as they're writing sort of myths. They're narrative, but they're not necessarily realistic fiction. So there is week 2's lecture coming in at 12 minutes and 34 seconds. So I hope you're doing well. I'm so excited to be reading your work right now. It's just been really terrific, and write without inhibition.